Hello, and welcome to the High Conflict Co-Parenting Podcast. In this podcast, we explore and dive into the stress-filled world of high conflict divorce and relationships. We offer solutions to calm your world down and allow for greater positive engagement with your children and the people around you. If you find value in this commercial and advertising-free podcast, please consider donating by pressing the donate button so we can continue our helpful work. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody, to the High Conflict Co-Parenting Podcast with Brooke Olson. And this week, my special guest is Mahshid Hager. Mahshid is a licensed marriage and family therapist. And the reason I wanted to have Mahshid here today is we've got a long history, and there's some gaps in the history, but we've got a long history. As a matter of fact, Mahshid came to one of my classes in the very early days, and I was still in the process of developing a lot of the thoughts and direction that I wanted to take the class. And I wanted to bring her in and talk about where we've been, where she's been, how that's developed, and as a therapist, how this has started to be in her awareness as well. So, Mahshid, again, she's a marriage and family therapist. She's a somatic experiencing practitioner, and she's on staff as a teacher with the Somatic Experiencing International. Welcome, Mahshid.
Thanks so much for having me, Brooke.
So 15 years later.
Yeah, we've got a lot to catch up on.
Your kids were small. As I recall, 6 and 7 or 7 and 8 at the time. Your oldest is 21 now, as you just said.
My youngest just turned 21.
Youngest turned 21. Wow. Blows me away.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask a little bit about, reflecting where your early experiences were in the high conflict arena as you started the process with me.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I had no idea I was in a high conflict divorce. I just thought that meant divorce is messy, I had no idea until the courts referred me to high conflict counseling. And I just remember those days as total chaos. I mean, I just could not find my way out of what felt like a never-ending tornado. And what your class helped me with was give me these pathways away from that chaos. It started off with just re-examining some of the things that I kind of held as inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the ways that I was contributing to the mess and to the conflict that I wasn't aware of, and giving me some real structure and discipline around how to best communicate in order to avoid these pitfalls I kept finding myself in.
Divorce is messy.
It is.
Almost always divorce is messy. And to come to that, the realization or the notion that it's high conflict is really a hard piece for a lot of people, even as the courts have started to understand that is an actual thing. Because back then, this notion of high conflict with the courts was really in its beginning stages. The notion of personality disorders and high conflict personalities and these things like Bill Eddy and some of the other people started to bring forward was very new. Mm-hmm. And again, coming into that awareness is like, oh, this is a thing. It's not just messy.
Yeah. So
one of the things that I remember as we started was, one, there was this back and forth that you and your now ex were in terms of just fighting over how to parent, what you were doing, what he was doing, where the kids were in that process. But you had one of your children, as I recall at the time, had been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD at the time. And you and your ex at the time were really fighting over how to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was at some point, at least when I was working with you, some of the apex of what the arguments were about. What did you do? What was your process in that as you started to deal with that portion of the conflict? I mean, here we've got something that is a special needs that required special attention. And on one end, there was, do we do medication? Is this really the problem? And on the other end, let's not do that because there's another way to approach that. How was that in your experience, and how did you work to resolve that? Because this is something that comes up frequently in our clients.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, with a lot of help and support, is how I navigated that. Because again, it was one of those situations where we would, as parents, fall into patterns of communication and our kind of like routine fights. A conversation about what my son's needs are at school specifically would very quickly devolve into, you always this, you never that, and all of our history coming into play. And one of the tools that I learned through my own therapy and through work with you was how to disengage from those patterns that were personal between him and me, and how to keep redirecting the conversation to, what do the kids need? And that meant that I had to educate myself in terms of, okay, he has this diagnosis of ADD and sensory processing disorder. What does that mean? What does that mean when a kid has those diagnoses? What is his body doing? What's his nervous system doing? Because of my work as a therapist, and because I spent so much time working with school-age children at the time, I knew that it wasn't a simple answer. I knew that it wasn't a quick fix. Just take this pill and it's going to be better. I knew my child's trauma history. I knew my own trauma history. I knew that he wasn't a problem behaviorally. At school, he often went unnoticed, not typical for ADHD children. And so I was hesitant to put him on medication because of those things. And my ex-husband did not want to be educated by me about what our kids' needs were. And that was the crux of the problem, because I felt like I'm coming to this as an expert in my field, and people pay me to give these opinions to them. And you're just dismissing them off the bat because they're coming from me. So it was like, how do I disengage from that fight with you? And then gather people around me and you who can give you that information in a way that you can receive it. So that meant, asking the teachers for questionnaires and letters describing what the problem was at school. Finding 3 therapists that my kids could go to, like pick one of these 3 therapists that they can go to, so the therapist can do an assessment and let you know. Let's talk to a couple of psychiatrists. I kind of took myself out of the equation, focused the issue more on the needs of the kids, and then found supports that could help communicate those needs to the kids that didn't necessarily, so that it didn't necessarily come from me because he wasn't listening to me.
So again, this is my recollection, and it's a long time ago, but he was reluctant to engage with any professionals along this pathway. What do you think you did in particular that was able to guide him in that direction so you could get him engaged with professionals, or were you able to do that at all?
I mean, I think I gave him some choices where I could. For instance, like which professionals we choose. He didn't pick my number one, best case scenarios. He brought his, he had his choices that he brought to the table. So I had to be a little bit more flexible, in terms of like, okay, like if this means that seeing this person versus, person A versus person B means that you're a little bit more open to it, then let's go with that for now, like just, and then that required me to do my own work to be able to be in that flexible space with him, and in other areas we wouldn't come to an agreement. Like he really wanted the kids to go to some private school that was 40 minutes from our house. And I remember we had to take that issue to the courts because it was like, you don't want to pay for it. You're not physically in San Diego, so I'm going to have to commute. This is just not something that's going to work. And so when we came to places where there was just no flexibility from either side, then we were forced to go to court over those issues.
Court always seems to come in here at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, in these arenas.
Yeah.
So you and I are both somatic experiencing practitioners. You much more in that arena than I am these days. But I keep coming back and leaning on this in terms of development of the nervous system for our kids as they are experiencing these traumas and the other traumas in their lives. And the divorce process and this continued conflict has a role or takes a role on the children. And the high conflict separation, the divorce, is usually indicative of something that was going on in the relationship already. There was already a turmoil, a large dissonance in the two ideas of how to parent and whatnot. And I have a thought, and I've had a thought, and I'm wondering what your response to this is. But I think with some of what happens for children with ADD, ADHD in particular, can be a result of that household environment coming forward, and they're looking for a place to find relief, settlement, and not being able to find that. Do you think that that's part of what's going on and part of what went on with your son?
Yeah, and this is why I didn't want to put him on medication, because I actually came to somatic experiencing trainings because of my kids. My therapist was a somatic experiencing practitioner. She referred me to the book Trauma Through a Child's Eye by Peter Levine and Maggie Klein. And through that process, I was like, let me go into the training just to get a little bit more nervous system education and information to try to figure out what's going on here. And yes, a dysregulated nervous system, which can happen as a result of high conflict in the house. It can result as a result of any type of trauma in the children's life. A dysregulated nervous system can have as its symptom ADD or ADHD. It's a nervous system that's kind of stuck in sympathetic fight-flight mode, and that can express itself as ADD, ADHD, anger issues, oppositional issues, all kinds of issues. And I'm certain that played a role in my kids' expression of their behavior.
So this always brings me back to parenting.
Mm-hmm.
And the essential piece of parents getting themselves regulated.
Oh, yeah.
Getting the parents in a place where they are not in this sympathetic activation all of the time, dealing with the conflict with the other parent. This is kind of where the development of the disengage sequencing came from. And how that nervous system is reflected in the child on a daily basis. So if that parent isn't regulated, the child can't be regulated. If both parents are always in conflict, that child's not going to be able to find that touchstone of regulation in their life anywhere, which is critical.
Mm-hmm.
So as you came through this portal of working as a therapist with somatics, as understanding the parenting that goes along with that, what do you think was the critical point at which you were able to shift and start to get your system regulated in it?
I'm thinking multiple branches of thoughts here. One is that the understanding that children, young children, infants, don't have the mechanisms developed to self-regulate. Mm-hmm. They depend on their parents' regulation so that they can co-regulate. And their regulation mechanism develops over time through this process of co-regulation. When a parent is dysregulated themselves, which I was at the time that my kids were infants, then I was not able to provide that co-regulation skill to my kids. And so I had to learn that piece myself. I had to learn to self-regulate, self-soothe. What does my nervous system need in order to not be reactive? So that then I could show up for my kids, be regulated so that they could regulate off of me. Okay. And so for me, part of that was my own work. Part of it was the work with you, understanding what things got my system going and avoiding those things. And to really like this focus on the kids rather than my ex. Like, so rather than focusing on how do I co-parent with this person who is so inflexible and rigid, to redirecting my focus to what do my kids need in order to have a calm environment at my house, a harmonious relationship between us. Yeah, does that answer the question? I lost the second part of that.
No, you answered the question. I have a follow-up question with it. Is what did you do in those years to learn how to self-regulate? What were the tools that you found, used, and developed to help you learn how to self-regulate?
I laugh because it was it was not an intuitive process for me, because I had my own trauma history going into the marriage to begin with, and so all of that needed to be worked. But I remember specifically my therapist walking me through, like, where in your day do you have time for yourself? And I just kind of laughed at her. I'm like, what are you talking about? Do you have any idea what it's like to be a single parent of 2 elementary school kids? And she really helping me understand how essential my own self-care was, Yeah, can you take 10 minutes? I remember we started off this way. Can you take 10 minutes between end of work and having to pick up your kids to just go walk around the block at their daycare before you get them at after school care? Just 10 minutes of walking before you get them every night after work. 10 minutes. Can you do that? And we had to negotiate that. And I had to really be disciplined about that. And then I would notice the difference. Like, it gave me transition time. It gave me an opportunity to put my workday behind, take some deep breaths while walking, get my kids. And now I was showing up differently for the rest of the night. The other thing that was an early suggestion was, because we were, having split custody, having kind of a ritual for when the kids transitioned from their dad house to my house, and from when the kids transitioned from my house to their house. I think you taught me that. Yep. Like, just do the same thing every time they come back from their dads. The first thing we do is we walk the dog, or we have this dinner on the first night that they're back. And before they leave, you do the same thing. And you let them know that mommy's going to be okay. While you're at dad's, I have these plans. I'm going to get together with Auntie D and we're going to have dinner. And so that the kids aren't leaving their mom alone as well. So just like very simple, practical tools. The other thing that I learned through the training and with my therapist's help was to recognize when my kids were using their own self-regulation tools and to not interfere with that. So when the kids come home and my son is not ready to transition right into snack time and homework time, he needs to cuddle on the couch for 20 minutes. That's his way of self-soothing and self-regulating. Encourage that,
That is so important, is to be aware of what the kids' self-regulating pieces are and let them have them and let them develop those, because that's the place that they're going to lean on later. That isn't leaning on us, but it's still leaning on us. The piece that I want to come back and circle on here for a quick second, Mahshid, is when you were talking about the transition times and the walking around the block for yourself. And when I look at those, when I started to teach those in class and having those transition pieces and the self-care, which certainly comes out of the SE and all of the pieces that you and I know, there's an intrinsic component to that I want to just kind of punctuate here for a moment. And that is orientation.
Mm-hmm.
And coming back to being able to orient to what is here and where I am and what is taking place as just that essential tool to self-regulation. It just seems to me to be the first point in that process of being able to come in and come out of any sympathetic activation that we're in and being able to notice that everything's okay right here.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, trauma and traumatic events and conflict are innately disorienting. They take us out of connection, not just with ourselves and with our loved ones. They take us out of connection with the here and now. And orienting brings us back into connection with the here and now. And I will add one more piece to that, which again, you taught me this early on, which is orienting to what's going well, what's going right.
Right.
You started every class with celebrations. Mm-hmm. And it would be often, I would come in that once a week, and that would be the first time that I would be thinking about, oh yeah, there must have been good things this week. What were they? And that is so important, because otherwise we're just like in that trauma vortex, in that tornado of chaos all the time. And those moments of celebration, those moments where things are going actually well, the kids are actually doing okay in their friendships, they're good friends. Those are so important to note. So orienting towards what's going well, orienting towards pleasure, it's the other thing I would add to that.
Right. One of the things that I've added to that, probably in the last 2 or 3 years, is taking that to another step. And I'd just be curious to hear what your thoughts are on it, is to not just what has been pleasurable in the last week for my clients, but what has been pleasurable for them that doesn't include their children.
Oh, yes, I remember this. This was harder. Yeah.
And again, finding that place of self-care that really helps spring this forward for the parents so they can be more present for their kids.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So trauma,
yeah,
as it's repeated and repeated and repeated, as often as it is in high conflict relationships, divorces, separations. Dick Schwartz talks a little bit about in his internal family systems model of legacy burden, what comes from our parents. And you spoke a little bit about your own trauma coming into this. Mm-hmm. And not needing to go into specifics, but how do you see how that progressed through your divorce, through your marriage, and how unwinding those pieces for you has been beneficial for your children? So we're kind of cross model here a little bit.
Yeah.
But I wondered about your thoughts with that.
So I came to the divorce with my own trauma history, which was, I was born in Iran and lived through the revolution there and the war with Iraq, and then escaped with my family to Germany. What this meant in terms of my family's nervous system is that a pattern of being in constant survival mode was conditioned and established early on. So my parents hit the ground running. That's the only option they had. Mm-hmm. They worked 2 jobs. Kids were left alone all the time. I remember taking care of my younger siblings at age 11, 12 years old. And the body, the nervous system cannot sustain that much sympathetic activation without a cost. The cost of it for my family was that we were more or less in freeze most of the time, like kind of a functional freeze. I can go, nothing much bothers me. When there is high conflict, I kind of freeze because, that's what's been conditioned in my system as the best mode of survival. Complete overwhelm. And so I came into my marriage with that, which meant that communication wasn't good. Fights didn't get resolved because he was sympathetically charged and I was in freeze. So he would get big and intimidating, and I would cower and just not say anything. And then the whole thing would just blow over in a few days. And as I started, I was still in grad school when we got married. And so the more I learned about therapy and personalities and communication, the more my system started waking up and coming out of freeze. And that was a new dynamic in our relationship. And so the more that I came out of freeze, the more conflict we had, because my ex-husband wasn't used to me talking back or me saying, we can't blow this one under the rug. We need to talk about this. This is a pattern that keeps happening. We have to resolve it. And so that ultimately was the demise of our relationship. Part of that was also parenting. I had kids, and now freeze wasn't an option. Freeze isn't an option when you have kids. You have to be there. You have to show up. And so that was kind of like the start of it all. And then for my kids, I lost your question about that.
It's okay. We'll swing back into that in a second. Yeah. So I think 2 things that I want to just again punctuate here is, as you started to change the dynamic, his activation didn't come in to alignment or come down, it went up.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Because of that change of the system dynamic.
Right.
Which is often exactly what happens. And then there was a differential in your parenting styles. Mm-hmm. My remembering of that is he was quite autocratic.
Yes.
And yours was much more in the authoritative model.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that dynamic that he brought forward is this is the way we do it. If you don't do it this way, there's going to be punishment. And you had, again, more of this authoritative type of parenting where you would come in and talk to the kids, help them regulate, do the things that an authoritative parent would do. And that caused problems.
Yes.
So you guys continued in these directions over the course of your children's life, correct?
Yes. To this day.
To this very day. So how does that express with your relationship with your children and with your children's relationship with their dad?
Oh. So for me, one of the things that, again, I learned from you is that I can only control what I do. I cannot control what their dad does. I can't to this day control that. And what I set off to do was, in this household, we do this. In this household, we communicate. In this household, we're respectful. In this household, your opinion matters. In this household, you may say no, and we can have a discussion. In this household, you can be angry at me and take some time, and we can come back together. In this household, I apologize when I lose it, you know? And so I kept repeating that with them. And then the heartbreaking thing for a parent is, I'm sending you off 50% of the time to a different household where that's not true. And I kept banking on this hope that the tools that they were gaining in our house would help them navigate their dad's house. And it was very, very, very challenging in the early days, very challenging. And I kept coming back to, I am going to make it easy for the kids to connect with me. And whatever that looks like, you know, if it makes it easier for them to disconnect from me for a bit in order to come back and reconnect with me, then we'll do that too.
That's important as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because that speaks of their overwhelm. That speaks of their freeze response. And I have to be respectful of that. And in that process, I kept helping them develop a voice that came from their gut. You know what I mean? Like, this conflict just came up with your dad. What do you think about that? What does your gut say? Like, what's the right way of handling that? What would you like to say to him if you could say anything? I'm not saying go and tell him, but what would you say to him if you could say anything at all? How does that feel to say that? Does that feel right? Does that have a yucky feeling to it? Or does it settle like it's true? And so I kept just using my tools to teach them about, you know, right from wrong, you know how to communicate, trust that. And what your dad does, that's his thing. And so over time, I watched the boys disengage from the conflict because they used to have conflict with them. And as they got older, they had the means of leaving. You know, I'm going to take my bike and I'm going to go. I'm going to take my car and I'm going to go. And so when their dad would get into one of his things, they would just leave and they would come over and they'd say, Dad is having one of his things. I'm going to give him a day and then I'm going to go back.
So they learned their own boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
They learned how to trust their own instincts.
Mm-hmm.
And they were self-regulated.
Totally. Yeah.
And that doesn't happen without a parent that teaches them that.
Yeah.
They have
and that
to.
meant I had to learn all of those things myself. Right. My boundaries, self-regulating, you know? Yeah.
That's amazing. And, you know, I've been able to watch over the years, you know, because we're on Facebook together and stuff, and just how that's developed with your children. And I'm just going to throw in another piece here because I think it's really super important, is that the development of your next relationship. You have been married for quite a while now.
Yes, 12 years this year.
And this is functioning.
Very well, yes.
Very well. It's more than just functioning, it's thriving.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, is a result of the work that you've done, your ability to choose your own partner that is outside of the dysfunction that was there before, because you can see a different patterning here.
Yeah. And like we took it super slowly because he had to learn all of those things that I had learned post-divorce. My now husband, boundaries, how to communicate with the ex, about what things to communicate with the ex, all of those things he had to learn as well.
So this brings a question forward to me.
Mm-hmm.
Was your current husband in a divorce that was high conflict?
He had never been married before.
He had never been married. So what through that process did he have to learn? Just what you were learning simultaneously? Or was there something else in there?
Well, his learning was a little bit different. He had to learn to be a parent all of a sudden,
right.
That and a parent in a high, in a high conflict situation. He came into this thing saying things like, we have to communicate with your ex, we have to get on the same side, we're not going to be able to do this without cooperation. He's a good guy, Brooke.
No, I get that, but I'm laughing because there's got to be a lot of people that are listening to this podcast that are in that piece and not being on the same page and not understanding the disengagement process and not understanding the high conflict personalities that come into this are it's difficult. So for step parents, for new partners, it's like I'm always telling them when I do have the opportunity to work with them to step back and watch what's going on and to disengage. And if your partner is learning these things, to trust them or do everything you can to get on the same page so you can trust them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I watched him make a couple of mistakes and get stuck like I used to, and then he slowly learned his way out of that. Yeah.
So there's a piece, and I'm going to bring this in because of your therapy, your therapy background, your background as a therapist in particular, and I'd like to just kind of shift gears a little bit and get a little bit of feedback from you. I talk about, and only because I need a touchstone for people to understand, I talk about personality disorders a lot. And I know through the SE model, through a lot of the other models, they don't like to go in that direction at all. It's just trauma. It's it is just that expression and the development of the trauma. But these particular pieces express in particular ways, whether if we go back to the DSM, whether it's borderline or narcissistic or histrionic or whatever those pieces are. And I find value in the DSM model because it talks about the behavior, not about the label. And I find that a lot of people coming through my classes and my practice, he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist, they're borderline, they're whatever those pieces are, and they're nailing these labels. And I feel like I have to use them, but I also have to come back and really talk about what they are, and as they are just trauma and behaviors to that. Any thoughts on that piece?
I I mean, I'm classically trained as a therapist, and so I still use the DSM a lot. And I agree with you that it gives people like guideposts, like this thing you're experiencing. Here's the definition of it. Are you recognizing these signs? It gives you sort of a place to start off from, and try to figure out what your behavior needs to do in order to match that, or in order to prevent having to be in conflict with that other behavior.
So again, it's just an orientation to what is and
Yeah.
how to navigate it.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you want to add to this conversation, Mahshid, that you think is important that we haven't navigated?
I mean, I feel like as a somatic experiencing practitioner, I do have to make a plug for becoming more embodied, just generally speaking.
Absolutely.
Like, I don't think people that know me today that didn't know me, 15, 20 years ago, will often wonder when they hear about my history, how I even ended up in a relationship like that. And my answer to that is because I was completely disembodied. Like I had no idea what was going on with me. I had no idea how trauma was impacting this connection. I had no idea I had no sense of my boundaries. I had no sense of my voice. I had no sense of my wants and needs. And I wouldn't be in the relationship that I am now if I wasn't more embodied. And so I think my recommendation is, just by whatever means possible, whether it's therapy, whether it's meditation, whether it's self-care, whatever it might be.
All of the above.
Yeah, or all of the above. Include your body in the equation, because the body has so much information.
It holds, I think, the key. To me, it's the absolute essential key to any other way of being present. You can't intellectualize any of this stuff. If we don't bring the body in, we don't get the information of where we are, whether we're dissociated or here. That is a body awareness, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if we're not aware of what the body's doing, I think by definition we're dissociated.
Totally. Yeah. And that has been the biggest gift to me in terms of parenting as well. Is showing up embodied with my kids means that they're learning to be more embodied. People will often tell me how good my kids are with people, like just neighbors will stop and say, your boys are so nice. They always greet us and make eye contact. And they have like really these long, rich relationships and friendships. And I think that's a testament to that, because they are more embodied because I became more embodied,
And that embodiment, let me reverse that for a second. Empathy doesn't happen without that embodiment. That is the beginning of that sequencing of being able to be aware of other.
Absolutely.
In that.
Yeah.
And this is the requirement of parenting, to help the child become self-aware through their development, so they can then begin to develop the mirror neurons that come around to being able to recognize other in that. And right. I think that for relationship is the keystone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking the time here. I've really enjoyed seeing you. It's been a long time. We've talked about, doing some collaboration along the way. I hope we can do some more.
Me too. Thanks so much for having me, Brooke.
Brooke, people don't have to wait until Friday mornings to
to get more content, if this is something that's helpful for them, right? This isn't the first time you've broadcast anything or recorded anything or put anything out there in the world. What are the other ways people can get the help more aggressively or speed up their recovery process? What materials are available for people right now?
Well, I've written a book called The Black Hole of High Conflict, and it's available on Amazon and Kindle.
Great.
And everything that we're talking about is really compressed and put into there. So this is a really good starter place to get in and get your mind working and to see what these concepts are about and how to start to apply them. The other place that I think that is valuable is to go to our website and look at some of the blog articles that I've written. Those are available there as well. They go into some of these other arenas, and that's at www.highconflict.net. So the book, the website are also really good places to get the material. And also we have classes. We have high conflict diversion program classes that you can get into and get some one-on-one help with this as well.
And you know me, I'm aggressive. Whatever I want to become good at or learn, I find someone who's good at it and pay them and hire them and shorten my learning curve. What if somebody just wants your help? Somebody says, Brook has this information. He's good at something I'm not good at yet, and I want to work with him. Do you have any type of coaching or consultations or anything like that?
Absolutely, I do. I do one-on-one coaching for custody cases. I help people get ready for family court services. If you've got that in your community, I work with attorneys and clients to help them with managing and strategically setting them up to have more successful cases as well.
And how do they reach out? You want them to just go to the website or email or phone, or what's the best way for them to reach out, raise their hand, and say, I need some help?
They can email me. My direct email is brook@highconflict.net. That's BROOK at highconflict, HIGH, conflict.net.
Perfect. That's everything everybody would need to get some help, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Brook.